Procedural generation has been a hot topic in the gaming industry among customers since Minecraft's explosive popularity. And it's been a topic among game developers for much longer than that. It's been used to a larger or lesser degree everywhere since video games were initially a thing. Put very simply, and skipping over a lot of other potential applications, if you are looking to create a truly massive world, handcrafting every detail of it would simply be too much work for a small team of developers, as it was the norm back in the day. And to create a semi-realistic sized world, one with a high level of fidelity, would be impractical, even with hundreds of millions of dollars behind your project. When people look at funding projects, people don't always grasp that there are variable diminishing returns for investment once it reaches a minimum threshold. And throwing more money at something won't actually improve the quality of the product without also increasing the time it takes to produce and ensuring that all the talent is on the same page. Feature creep has killed more projects than it has any right to. And even if you were to throw hundreds of millions of dollars at a project, there's no guarantee that it will be successful in the long run at producing a fully realized product. Star Citizen. The bottleneck for these projects tends to be, but isn't always, the management skills of the project lead. So you created an algorithm that filled that gigantic world for you. Then you handcrafted elements of the world. Or if you were truly ambitious, you tuned the algorithm to such an insane degree that you may as well have created handcrafted areas, as far as the player knows. It's all in the presentation. In the past, I've tended to cover Elder Scrolls games. My favorite among them has long since been a toss-up between Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall and Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. We'll talk about Morrowind first. Elder Scrolls 3 has a very small but detailed, handcrafted world that takes place on the island of Vardenfell. Settlements present themselves as small to moderate size, but usually take advantage of twists and turns, coupled with the game's short view distance to prevent a player from seeing all of a settlement in a single view. More importantly, the alien atmosphere helps any breaks from reality slip comfortably within the player's suspension of disbelief. I don't think any person who has actually pondered the logistics of building, populating, and scripting advocates for realistically sized city-states. That said, there's something I've noticed a lot of video game critics take for granted. Video games are crafted first and foremost as an experience. Nothing needs to follow real-life standards, and every rule in the cosmos can be bent or broken if it means forging the experience the creator aims for. If I sit down and explain Death Stranding to you purely from a mechanical standpoint, I'm sure the vast majority of players would never want to play it. But its monotonous gameplay is instrumental in crafting an experience that I would struggle to explain without a lot of subjective terminology. I would consider Death Stranding to be a bad video game, but it is a unique and valuable experience. An artistic experience that speaks to the human condition. I could say the same thing about Pathologic, a brutally unforgiving game that has horrible mechanics, that explains almost nothing to the player, but rather that is the intended experience that the developers have put in front of the player because fun wasn't the objective that they had in mind when they crafted Pathologic. The game's goal, its aim, is an artistic one. That's why I promote looks at Death Stranding and Pathologic, but I don't recommend them as video games to anyone, especially not people who want to have a good time and relax. Despite being tiny, the island of Vardenfell in Elder Scrolls 3 manages to have a well-deserved reputation of peerless world building. The actual world design of Vardenfell is mediocre by the standards of open-world games, and while people may remark on it being breathtaking for the time, I suspect those people weren't very well versed in other video games released around the same time. That's where I need to remind people of the difference between world design and world building. World design is the placement of landscape, buildings, structures, and other doodads that inform the player experience. World building, on the other hand, is an element of story. We often talk about video game lore. Well, lore is an element of world building. All of these elements come together to make the story of the game. That is the emotional journey the player goes through during the experience. World building, however, isn't limited to lore. Every aspect of the game informs world building, from the most important things like narrative and character dialogue to elements of the world design like architecture and character appearance, all the way down to what plants grow where. and what shops sell. Morrowind, for example, has a clear distinction between Dark Elf settlements and Imperial settlements. That means a lot from a world-building perspective, but was clearly conceived of in the world design space. The disparate factions of Morrowind and how they treat each other has a huge amount of effort put into it, with details down to the sources of their conflicting ideological motivations. They don't just believe different things. It is explained in painstaking detail why they believe the things that they believe. But to the player who doesn't take the time and explore all those notes and books they are handed across the main quest, they wouldn't be aware of those aspects of the game's world building. I'm not saying the player has to sit down and read every goddamn lore book from the bookstore, but I am saying that the player is often handed materials during the main quest, which inform the actions of the factions in that main quest. They explain the actions of the people around them, and why the world is the way it is. It's not the same as having a lore entry pop up in Doom 2020. Rather, the books in Morrowind have a reason to be where they are. In-universe, written by in-universe people. They are handed to you for a reason, which is explained within the story of the game. If the player misses it, they will functionally be able to make the same journey as the player who reads the book, but with a far less understanding of why things are the way they are. So when we talk about how great Morrowind's world building is, it is predicated on the player taking the time to process it as it is presented to them. Even if they don't, however, the atmosphere, NPCs, and the gist of the story will be conveyed to them anyway by the game's bare-bone dialogue and journal systems. This meticulously detailed world building wouldn't be possible, or at least it would be far more difficult to achieve within a procedurally generated world. Morrowind is a crafted experience, and while you can make the conscious choice to venture its open world in any direction you want, the game design will signpost you to important locations and NPCs before you even exit the tutorial area. Many factions will require that you travel to those important locations along their quest lines. And most importantly, the level design itself will attempt to funnel you to that location, if you choose to follow the path of least resistance. This is the game design principle of conveyance, and it's in pretty much every video game with an intended course for you to follow. Now let's compare this to Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, which I long held as would be my favorite Elder Scrolls game if it wasn't so buggy. Unlike your average, what do they want to be called these days? Games analyst, essayist, question mark, that you'll find online, I have very little concern for the intended experience compared to my own enjoyment when playing video games. I outgrew the competitive need to play things the way they were meant to be played in the late 90s, early 2000s. Modding games in order to improve my own player experience has been a thing I did myself originally, and eventually with the advent of the World Wide Web, I was able to download other people's mods. Modding became the default for me after the first playthrough of a game, and always opens a plethora of new possibilities within older games. So while I have enjoyed Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall immensely, Daggerfall Unity being more or less feature complete now means I can enjoy Daggerfall without the majority of bugs or glitches, thereby dethroning Elder Scrolls III as my favorite game in the series. Now, we'd be here all day if I started comparing things like Morrowind Rebirth and Tamriel Rebuilt to things like basic roads in World of Daggerfall, so we won't be doing that. Say there isn't value in that conversation about what mods bring to the table in each game, but we can save that conversation for another day, framed in a different way. I mentioned mods because they allow me to enjoy these games without bugs, and that is a vast departure from the vanilla experience of falling through staircases in Daggerfall and having your save file corrupted in Morrowind. So, Daggerfall features a massively procedurally generated world about the size of Great Britain in terms of landmass. While it features towns and cities that would more resemble real-life villages or small towns, it is a huge departure from the handcrafted homesteads and small villages that pass for cities in the current generation of Elder Scrolls handcrafted games. The empty space between locations in the wilderness, for those who pay attention, creates a sense of scale. Most of that space is empty, but that's That's all it needs to be in order to spark the imagination. Like folks who wandered around the desert and died in the classic Dune adventure game in 1992. That's around 4 years before Daggerfall's release. Unlike that desert, however, Daggerfall does have things in its wilderness. Witch covens, tiny hidden towns tucked in obscure locations. It's a far cry from a dense map like Skyrim. But again, the sense of scale is mostly an illusion, as other than brief manual travels, the player will be using the fast travel system to move around the world. This is the biggest point of disconnection I see when people discuss gaming featuring procedurally generated worlds, is the point where games ask you to fill in the details yourself. Some people are capable of it, and those people enjoy the games immensely. This most commonly takes the form of identical or mostly identical areas that ask the player to imagine them as separate spaces. For example, Daggerfall uses blocks of identically laid out houses combined in different ways to create the illusion that each town is unique, when in fact they are jumbled up versions of the previous town. In No Man's Sky, every space station is exactly the same, with only an occasional interior doodad switched around. Doodad is an industry term meaning props in the environment, like a table the player isn't really meant to interact with, but adds atmosphere to that location anyway. In Starbound, the mini biomes you'll encounter feature small dungeons that have the exact same layout or the exact same inhabitants. The point is, every time you come across a new town in Daggerfall, the game world expects the player to suspend their disbelief and buy into the fantasy that this is a new location, even though you've seen those buildings laid out in mostly the same way in a previous town. I've noticed a contingent of folks who are either unable or unwilling to do this, and actively get offended at the notion that the game would ask you to do this. As I've mentioned in a previous video graphic role-playing games are specifically descendants of the tabletop role-playing game. Their original goal was to as closely as possible replicate that experience while visually representing as many aspects as possible while describing the rest in text. The graphical games are a descendant of text-based games that couldn't visually represent anything other than maybe an ASCII sword or a map. All of these games, to some greater or lesser degree, ask the player to engage their imagination, and that's why they're capable of doing such incredible things for players who are able to and willing to take that step. That is not to say that all procedurally generated games with vast empty spaces are good. A more on-the-nose example, for every No Man's Sky, as it is now, you have a No Man's Sky on release with virtually identical underlying procedural generation tech, but the actual video game is far more enjoyable to the average player. This wasn't achieved by handcrafting every planet instead of using procedural generation. It was by creating a more compelling core gameplay loop and side objectives to enjoy during that loop. Before that gameplay loop existed, there was a spotlight on how little variation there was between locations. If I plopped you into one of two random locations in the real-life Mojave Desert, you may not be able to tell the difference between those two locations. And that's because real-life wilderness can sometimes be just empty. In other words, realism isn't that important. Just running in a random direction in No Man's Sky for the sake of exploring is something you can do. But it wouldn't be engaging at all if the landscape wasn't littered with buried technology modules, knowledge stones, and other useful trinkets. Basically breadcrumbs along the way. Eventually, the player needs to have some form of guidance to justify their traveling. In games like Daggerfall, most of this is done by giving the player missions to go on. If not the main quest, then smaller jobs at the various guilds. This justifies your travel into the wilderness and your travel to dungeons. Dungeons themselves are interesting in Daggerfall because they are assembled in blocks or prefab architecture. Once you've memorized where that secret door is in a certain module, and you've identified that module in a future dungeon, you will always know where that secret door is again. And although the game features several variants of each module, if you pay enough attention, there aren't enough variants that you can't easily memorize them all. And that's for someone like myself with poorer than average pattern recognition faculties. In other words, Daggerfall's dungeons, despite being big, are not necessarily good. And that's not due to them being procedurally assembled sets of blocks, it's due to the fact there simply aren't enough block samples to work with. If you you tripled or quadrupled the number of blocks and set up complicated rules about how those blocks were allowed to interact with each other, especially in creating spaces that created the illusion of people living there, it would go a long way to making Daggerfall's dungeons better. But everything I'm saying is hinging on one's suspension of disbelief, because the art assets ultimately will be limited, meaning you will visually be seeing the same things again and again and again. This is where we notice a stark division between people in the gaming space. Most people place a high value on how games look. I'm not saying there's no value in a game's art. However, I am saying that my only real consideration is that the game's art style remain internally consistent and not look glitchy or broken. I can pretty much buy into any art style, and that includes text-based games without even ASCII art. But even for the subset of people willing to buy into absolutely any art style or any level of quality, there is such a thing as tile set fatigue. That is when you deal with the same environment for too long, that environments can become displeasing to the eyes. I think a great example of this is Warframe. Warframe is not an RPG. It's not even an MMO, despite people calling it that. It is a third-person shooter and hack-and-slash action adventure game where you're given a series of missions to go to. And those missions, from the very start, have put you into procedurally generated blocks of levels. Unfortunately, for a while, you could only get end-game parts, known as primes, from the Void, and the Void was a single tile set. So people would burn out on that Void tile set, and they would become disinclined to play the game again, knowing that they'd have to go back to the Void again. The game is much more enjoyable now than it was back then, because you are able to go to a variety of tile sets and get your prime items pretty much anywhere. But tile set fatigue is why almost every MMORPG's expansion, and no, ESO doesn't count for reasons I'm not explaining here, but almost every MMORPG's expansion uses a metaphorical bag of Skittles for their zones. Take Northrend in World of Warcraft's expansion pack Wrath of the Lich King. In Warcraft 3's Frozen Throne expansion, Northrend was depicted as the frozen cap of the world. But take a look at the map in World of Warcraft, and one of the first zones they depict is lush green hills. That's because they wanted players upbeat and excited to have a visually refreshing place to go back to after spending the end game in the two desolate wasteland zones up north. You notice that Mario games dating back all the way to the NES have Ice World, Fire World, Plant World, Desert World. That's to visually refresh the player as well. But in the case of World of Warcraft and Mario, that's all handcrafted content. Things get a little more complicated when you have procedurally generated locations. Daggerfall attempts to separate the biomes between desert, temperate, mountain, and swamp, with variants based on season. This of course does absolutely nothing for the dungeons, which can only change out their simple textures to like one or two variants, but retain the same system of blocks that they assemble. There can't be any weather effects or different trees. Daggerfall's dungeons are basically as they are, and that is simply an issue with the procedurally generated dungeons having their algorithm be too simple. Now, Starbound is a great game. Although it ended active development in 2019 with roughly 20 biome types for planets, although this keeps players visually refreshed, one paradise planet will bleed into another. They basically all look the same. This is a hurdle that players need to overcome or quit based on their suspension of disbelief, just like with No Man's Sky. Kraken Universe mod for Starbound, however, is still in development to this day, and it more than doubles the biome count, among other things. But back to vanilla. Circling back around to the core gameplay loop. While No Man's Sky is about exploration, Starbound is about 2D side-scrolling platforming and sometimes intense combat. Funny enough, No Man's Sky has mobility, weapons, and upgrades capable of supporting Starbound's level of player skill being required in terms of high fire, high-speed combat. No Man's Sky's equipment that the player is given is capable of it, but the game insists on being casual regardless. In No Man's Sky, even with xenomorph swarms, which when they were originally released could only bite and claw, but now can shoot acid from their tails as well, making them far harder, are still extremely casual compared to most Starbound enemies. That's not even mentioning Starbound's bosses. This means that Starbound is much more active and requires that you be very present and in the moment. But due to how Starbound's hunger system works, you are also seeing those monsters as opportunity for hunting, provided you don't invest in agriculture. So Starbound focuses on smaller, more tightly controlled sandboxes with a gigantic universe between them, comparable to No Man's Sky, or at least how the end user interfaces with it. Each approach keeping the player engaged in their own way. No Man's Sky with exploration, Starbound with combat. Both games feature resources to collect, dirt to dig, bases to build, tech trees to progress through. And while I could say one game is better than the other, and I probably will in a future video, I think the general takeaway from all this is that for a game with procedural generation to be considered good is the effectiveness of the game's core gameplay loop, if it can hook and hold the player. And that's about it. The world is important. Having a giant world is amazing and I love it, but the game needs to be fun first. Now you may be thinking I'm arguing in favor of gigantic, empty worlds. And there is a concept in design known as negative space. It actually adds to the value of the smaller areas. However, Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall has been looking pretty nice lately. The Daggerfall Unity program allows new, built from the ground up version of Daggerfall to be run in the Unity engine. Contrary to popular terminology, it's not a source port. There is no source available. You know how source unavailable Daggerfall is? Bethesda doesn't even have it. The lead programmer of Daggerfall went to Bethesda whenever Bethesda was going to do its anniversary bundle and offered them his skills to fix the game. Bethesda agreed, but had to come back to him and admit they lost the source code for it later. In spite of that, Daggerfall Unity has been worked on for years. It's an open source reimplementation of Daggerfall's assets into effectively a new video game EXE. It has slightly higher system requirements than the original Daggerfall, but it's extremely scalable with its retro rendering mode, allowing it to turn it into an experience that is pretty faithful to the original, and modding support that allows it to go beyond what the original was capable of. In the process of Daggerfall Unity, the data files for Daggerfall had to be combed through to such a thorough degree that there's no mystery about any of the mechanics anymore. And between DF Workshop and UESP, the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages, you can look at pretty much any aspect of Daggerfall. The game is valuable as a piece of history for archival purposes, but the base game is also so utterly broken. And I don't just mean occasionally falling through the world. Class advantages or disadvantages that do entirely different things from their descriptions, various class skills that are either only half working or entirely broken, many quest triggers that just refuse to go off at all, or breaking certain quests entirely. In short, it's a wonder how we ever played the game in the first place. And the answer is we did it not knowing how broken it was, and just being frustrated at how unfair the game used to be. Or, like many games back in the day, we used exploits so severe that we were able to break the game going the other way in our favor. Despite retaining the beta label, Daggerfall Unity is feature complete and can be played from start to finish. It will likely retain the beta label until the authors are done with expanding mod support, localization support in non-English languages, and more. But mod support was the actual reason I mentioned Daggerfall Unity in the first place, because through Daggerfall Unity we've seen 3 major mods that solidify the notion that wilderness content matters. The first is travel options, formerly known as tedious travel. Travel options changes the travel menu into a set of options about how you want to travel, whether you want to instantly teleport there via classic fast travel, or whether you want to use time dilation to travel across the world faster. It all depends on which options you use in the travel menu. Prior to this, in the vanilla game, the wilderness was simply a void that if you wandered off into, it was very unlikely you'd find another town in your journeys. Combined with the short view distance, and you'd go right past towns and never notice. With travel options, you can travel at 10, 20 times normal speed, zooming past empty parts in the wilderness, but with the option to stop midway if you notice something interesting. Before, other encounter-based mods filled the gap, with Kamer's Warm Ashes being the most notable example. Add road encounters to the game. There used to be single monster encounters every once in a while, but nothing quite like what mods have brought us. Either way, the second major mod to transform the wilderness was simple roads. Whereas before, the wilderness was just an endless collection of valleys, hills, and flatlands, now simple roads connects each of the towns via cobblestone roads and dirt paths, turning the void into a grid that the player can travel on. This makes towns feel far less isolated, as if all of the Iliac Bay was one large game space, which it always has been. Travel Options does have Simple Roads integration, where you can literally use the Travel on Road button and perform a travel along the road. I would argue that Simple Roads is when Daggerfall felt the most complete as it's ever been in regards to the wilderness, at least until World of Daggerfall came out. Ship docks for port cities, watchtowers, regional borders, bandit camps, and far more. Hills and mountains and other regional locations. World of Daggerfall takes what used to be generic wilderness and populates it. Combine that with fixed dungeon exteriors, and now the outdoors feel a lot more alive, despite not really being dense to the point of tripping over the next area like with Skyrim. These mods change the atmosphere of the game in a major way, primarily from a dungeon crawler to a game where it actually feels good to cross the overworld in real time, because the overworld just existed to express scale previously. It was never meant to be traversed outside of a minor discovery here or there. And so, yes, we can prove that through mods. A big, empty open world is inferior to a big populated open world. Nobody needs to be told that. But things you think you know versus things you can prove do matter.